Hi and welcome to the Global Travel Planning Podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Collins, who with my expert guests will take you on a weekly journey to destinations around the globe, providing travel inspiration, itinerary ideas, practical tips and more to help you plan your next travel adventure. Hi and welcome to episode 21 of the Global Travel Planning Podcast. This week I chat with Canadian John Johnston all about the area of Niagara in southern Ontario. Now John shares information about things to do and see in the region, plus tips about travelling to and around Niagara Falls, plus a suggested itinerary. Now, I first met John in Phuket at a travel blogger conference, TBEX, in November 2022, and again in Kalamata, Greece in May 2023. So I knew John would be a perfect guest to come onto the podcast to share information about his many travels around the world. But I thought we would start with this episode with a chat all about John's home turf of southern Ontario, in particular the popular destination of Niagara and, of course, Niagara Falls. But I started the conversation with John asking him to tell us all about his website and his motivations behind his many travels around the globe.
Well, basically, I started the website, which is called bucketlistthings.com, because I actually watched the movie The Bucket List with, Morgan Freeman and I'm trying to remember, Jack Nicholson. And it seemed like an amazing thing to do, all those things that you want to check off your list before you kick the bucket. So I decided, well, I'll sit down and make up my bucket list. And what wound up happening was it wound up just a list of 200 places I wanted to go in the world. And I thought, well, that's kind of, it's just a travel list. So I've started doing things in each location that are a little bit unique. And it's aimed really at the adventure budget traveler who wants to do something active. So for example, if you're going to go to Peru, you may as well hike the Inca Trail. Or if you're going to go to China, you want to maybe visit the Great Wall, but you want to visit it in a place where other people don't. So that's really been my motivation, is to go to different places, do different things. Canyoneering in the Philippines was another one. So I've got a pretty long list. And the problem is the list doesn't get shorter.
Yeah, I guess the more that you travel, the more that you add things onto the list. I totally understand that one. I kind of go, I've visited this place, but I've only seen this part of this place, and I'd like to go and experience this in that place, or go back and do this sort of thing. So I totally understand that. So I mean, how many countries have you visited? Do you count countries or not? How many places have you visited off that list?
I actually do. I've got 48 countries so far.
Okay, that's cool. And what?
So,
do you have a favorite?
You know what? I have a lot of favorites. I don't think there's anywhere I wouldn't go back to. The problem that I run into is there's so many places that I want to go that I just can't keep going back over and over again. So I usually try and do 6 or 7 trips a year to different locations, and the further away they are, the longer they are. So for example,
and you travel those solo, John?
I travel them solo for the most part. Occasionally I'll have somebody who says, "You're going to where?" And then they say, "Can I go?" So occasionally I'll do that. And I tend to travel staying in hostels, which, doesn't exactly appeal to the budget traveler, the luxury traveler, but you get to meet a lot of really great people, and you get to have a lot of unique experiences.
So you must have a huge network of friends that you've met all over the world now, I'm guessing.
I'm trying to.
Well,
I certainly have more than, more friends on my list than enemies, I hope.
Oh, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do.
But I mean, where I live is actually an adventure spot for other people. When I look at other people's bucket lists, often you see visit Niagara Falls. And certainly honeymooners think Niagara Falls is just a wonderful place to go. And it is.
And that's a perfect segue into actually talking about, because the whole purpose of this episode is to actually talk about where you live in Canada. So we were just talking before we started the podcast about the fact that 30 something years ago, a long time ago, I actually lived in Toronto, but I've not been back. So this is a bit of a selfish episode as well for me, John, because this is a great way for me to get some ideas and some thoughts for planning to revisit. Because after 34 years, I think it's about time that I went back.
Well, it's true. And I mean, this past summer, I actually did take a day and played tourist in my own town, in my own region. Yeah, and to kind of cite this, Niagara Falls, or the Niagara region, is in the center of Canada. It's in the province of Ontario. It is right at the junction of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. There are the rest of the Great Lakes are Huron, Superior, who am I missing? Lake Michigan.
Yep.
And so consequently, it's really a travel area that encompasses a lot of the waterfront. And you can use it as an anchor to do day trips around. So most people come to Toronto and then they do Niagara Falls as a side trip, which is really not a bad strategy at all. I've actually run into other people who've flown into Toronto and have a 12-hour layover and have actually tried to go to Niagara Falls and back. And they see the falls and they're happy.
Yep.
So what makes Niagara Falls interesting is geologically it's interesting because the rock face and the fact that there is a escarpment or a line of limestone that runs about 400 kilometers from Niagara Falls all the way up to Tobermory, Ontario. And that bench is what actually causes the falls to occur. Lake Erie is actually 100 meters higher than Lake Ontario. So the water flows through the Niagara River out of Lake Erie, goes over the falls, and comes out in Lake Ontario. So that kind of gives you an idea of the height of the falls. And there are actually two falls there. There's Niagara Falls, or the Niagara Falls itself, and also the Horseshoe Falls. So the Horseshoe Falls and the American Falls on the other side. So there's two waterfalls for the price of one.
Yeah, I do remember that. When I visited, I remember, because I had no idea because I lived in Toronto. I think there was a whole load of us went down to Niagara for a couple of days. And I had no idea. I literally had Niagara Falls in my head. It's just one set of waterfalls. And then there was the Horseshoe Falls. And I was like, So, yeah, you do. You get two waterfalls for the price of one.
Yeah, and now they're a major attraction. So you can see it from the American and the Canadian side. The view not being nationalistic, but the view from the Canadian side is just that much better. So the water flows down over the falls through the Niagara Gorge. And at one point back in the 20s and 30s, it was famous for tightrope walkers who tried to walk from the Canadian side to the American side on tight ropes and perform over top of the falls.
And I remember, wasn't there people that used to go over in barrels over the falls as well?
Exactly. So there have been lots of people. I think only one or two have survived. The last one was a fellow who jet skied off the top of the falls and tried to open a parachute, and I don't think was successful. So yeah, it's every year people manage to drive their boats out into the Niagara River and the motor seizes up and they have to be rescued before they go over the falls. So that's not the way to sightsee around the falls.
No, definitely not.
To get here, you can fly into a number of different airports. It's driving distance within the northern United States or within Canada. But most people would fly into Toronto, or they can fly into Buffalo, which is a smaller regional airport. So when you take a look, the Buffalo airport's about 28 miles from Niagara Falls, Ontario. And they have shuttles that go directly from the airport, cross over the border, and you can go into Canada. So if you're from the US and you want to come up to Niagara Falls, just fly into Buffalo, and then you can take the shuttle across the border. You can rent a car and come across the border, or even take a taxi to the border and walk across. The Buffalo and Niagara Falls, New York, are very close together, and they're directly across from Niagara Falls, Ontario. You can fly into Toronto. So Toronto is about 120 kilometers away from Niagara Falls, and it's well served by bus lines. So Flixbus, Megabus, and our own regional transit system, GO Transit, go directly from Toronto Airport out to Niagara Falls. So there's plenty of options. One of the easiest ways to do it if you fly into Toronto is, of course, rent a car and drive. It's highway driving pretty much all the way, and you can be in Niagara Falls in less than an hour from Toronto Airport. You can also go from Toronto Airport into Toronto, stay there for a week, and do a day trip out to Niagara Falls or an overnight trip. And there is direct rail transit that goes right through to Niagara Falls from Toronto. So you've got multiple ways of going there.
So I remember when I did this trip 34 years ago, actually my stepfather at the time was working in somewhere in the US, which I can't remember where he was now, but he flew up to Toronto and then hired a car. And then we drove down to Niagara Falls. So I've got some lovely photos from 30 odd years ago, me looking a little bit younger than I do now, at Niagara Falls. But I do remember as well on the way that we stopped off on a few places. So I guess you don't have to just do the Toronto straight to Niagara Falls, that there are maybe places that you could stop off at. Now, I do remember, and interestingly, I was at a vineyard in Margaret River last week, and the guy that was serving the wine, which I can't remember his name now, but he was from Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I was like, I've been to Niagara-on-the-Lake. So that was the first place that I thought of.
That was one of the places I was going to mention.
Yeah.
Around Niagara Falls, you've got Port Colborne, Port Dalhousie, Niagara-on-the-Lake, which really could be an episode all on its own, but I'm going to talk about that as well. You've also got the Jordan Valley and what are called the benchlands, which are the area just below this cliff-like escarpment where I live, where the wine country is. And then St. Catharines is another town that you can visit. And that's where the Welland Canal allows ships to bypass Niagara Falls and get into the upper Great Lakes.
Ah, okay.
And that's a phenomenal engineering thing to see. So I mean, there's lots of ways to get to Niagara Falls. There are probably 200 hotels in Niagara Falls, ranging from the very luxurious or the top chains, the Wyndhams, the Ramadas, and so on. You also have two big casinos with attached hotels that are right in Niagara Falls. So if you're a gambler or you want to see entertainment, you can go there as well. And those rooms have some really lovely views out over the falls. So you can do that as well.
And is there a time of year that I'm just going to, because again, I suppose because I'm going back on my own memories, so kind of interjecting a little bit, but I remember visiting the falls in the summer, but I also remember going in the winter and they kind of had frozen up a bit. So is there a better time of year to go, or is there like a most popular time of year to go that's going to be more expensive to book any of those hotels and like a low season? Or what would you say to people that were thinking about going?
Well, the summer is busy, particularly the end of June, July, and August, simply because all the kids are out of school And parents see that in the Toronto area as a great day trip to take the kids to Niagara Falls. You'll also find people coming in for a week's vacation. So you can expect heavy crowds during the summer simply for that reason. But it really is a year-round destination. The best times, I think, are spring and fall. You know, you've got in the fall beautiful foliage all the way along the Niagara Gorge to look at, and it's really a great backdrop to the falls. In the winter, it does freeze over, and in fact, when we had the polar vortex here, the falls actually froze completely.
Wow.
Which is the first time I think it had done it in 75 years or so, which is really something to see. And the other thing is they light it up during the winter. So there are spotlights playing on the falls. And they do have something called the Festival of Lights, where they put animated Christmas lights all the way along the Niagara Parkway. So you can go along and look at the light displays on the right-hand side and Niagara Falls on the left.
That sounds magical.
As I said, you can go really anytime. So the winter, of course, is much less crowded.
Yeah.
The other thing to think of is the weekday versus the weekends. You probably have 3 times the crowds on the weekends because everybody's off work. So midweek is a perfect time to go and visit Niagara Falls, no matter what time of the year it is.
Perfect. So we've kind of covered about Niagara Falls itself, why visit, and the kind of where it is, the geographical information about the falls, which is fascinating because I had no idea. I mean, I've seen the fall, I've been to visit the falls, but I had no idea about that. And I know I've stayed in the falls before, and I know in 34 years it's going to have developed massively from when I was there last time. But so if I'm thinking about an itinerary for next year, and say we fly into Toronto, we'll probably stay in Toronto for probably a week and refamiliarize myself with Toronto itself, and then drive down to the falls itself. Have you got kind of like an itinerary that you could suggest for us to do, John?
Sure. One of the things that you can do is Niagara Parks has really got things organized very well. They have 3 kinds of passes that get you into most attractions. So, for example, you can get a pass that takes you to some of the basics, and I'm just going to go through with you some of the things that you can see in Niagara Falls. So, for example, there is the Maid of the Mist, which is a little boat that takes you right out to the base of the falls. You wear a slicker or a raincoat, and you get soaking wet, but
yes, I remember
it's just an awesome view.
Yeah, I remember that so well. So well, that's probably the biggest memory I have of the kind of being with my yellow raincoat on and being like under the falls and like all the water. It was amazing.
Well, it's really an adventure, and then you can actually now walk down to the base of the falls. There is a walkway along the edge of the falls, down by the river on the lower part of the falls. But Niagara Falls was a great hydro generating area. So there are power stations that were built to harness the drop of water over the falls. And that has now been converted into a tourist attraction. These are now decommissioned. There still is hydroelectric generation, but the old power station is now a tourist attraction. So you get in an elevator, they take you down, you walk through a long tunnel that used to carry the water, and you can actually come out behind the falls. And there is a viewing platform where you see the waterfalls coming down in front of you.
Wow, that sounds incredible.
Again, you wear a slicker because it's going to be pretty wet.
Yes.
There is an incline railway that you can use, and it's really good for people going from the upper part of Niagara Falls down to the lip of the falls itself. And that's pretty good for people who are mobility challenged, and they can get right down to the edge. Further down the river, there is a set of whirlpools and a set of rapids. And there's actually a cable car that goes right over the top of the whirlpool rapids and then brings you back. It's an antique car. It's been running for at least 60 years now. And it gives you an incredible view up the river of the falls, but also the rapids flowing down below the falls. There's a zip line.
Oh.
And then which you can take, but I haven't done it. I watched them do it. I've done plenty of zip lines. I just, never thought I'd do that one so close to home.
Well, I'll tell you what, John, if I'm over next year and you happen to be at home, we'll do the zip line together.
Well, we can do them tandem, side by side.
Yeah, let's do that. That's a challenge.
Exactly. We'll do that. There's some other things that you can do. One of the things that's changed a little bit, or grown actually, since you were here, was the main street, Clifton Hill, which comes up from the falls into Niagara Falls proper, is more of an entertainment area now. It's got bars and fun houses and amusement parks and all kinds of activities for kids. Fun houses that'll scare them, and, little motor racing things and Ferris wheels and roller coasters and so on. So there's a lot of things to do no matter what age you are. Of course, there's 2 casinos. So if you're older, you've got all kinds of entertainment options there in the evening. And during the summer, there are fireworks over the falls every night at about 10:30 or so.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So you've got, if you have a room that looks out over the falls, you can get amazing photographs of the fireworks going off above the falls.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Now, all of these activities, there's probably about 10 or 15 things to do. They are all linked by a tourist bus. So once you're in Niagara Falls, you can park your car and leave it and just get around on the tourist bus, because parking is kind of horrendous in Niagara Falls. So you can buy the adventure passes. The basic pass, which gets you into a multimedia show about the history of Niagara Falls and as well the journey behind the falls, is about $64 for a one-day pass that gets you into 5 or 6 of these activities and gives you 24 hours on that tourist bus. Then there is a second one called the Niagara Falls Pass, which is $84 Canadian, and that gives you 2 days and an additional 3 or 4 activities. So about 5 attractions that you can get into, a couple of parks, and the tourist bus. And then the last one is a 3-day pass, which gets you into every attraction in Niagara Falls, and then gives you 3 days on the tourist bus, as well as a shuttle over to Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Okay, that's good.
So that's sort of my segue into, you can spend 3 days in Niagara Falls and keep yourself really busy.
Yeah.
You can spend a day and just do a quick in and out from Toronto. So, for example, you could take the train down in the morning, do the day in Niagara Falls, take the train back at night, and not rent a car. But a car gives you that much more flexibility. About 10 kilometers down the road from Niagara Falls is a tiny little town called Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is nestled among vineyards. There's 30 or 40 vineyards in the location of Niagara-on-the-Lake, as well as 2 historical forts. The forts, the whole Niagara region actually has an interesting history, because the Americans kept trying to attack the British back during the War of 1812. So we have forts on both sides of the rivers that have reenactments and interesting things to see. And you can get into those forts. 2 of them are in Niagara-on-the-Lake. But Niagara-on-the-Lake has a phenomenal number of high-end bed and breakfasts. They have some really lovely vintage hotels that date back to the late 1800s, and they've been renovated and brought up to code. So they're lovely places to stay. Great food, great vineyards, great entertainment, and it's flat. So it's very bicycle friendly. You can rent bicycles and stay completely off the roads through a network of bike paths that go between attractions. And for those that, perhaps are a little bit older, you can rent e-bikes, and they'll get you around with a little bit less effort.
That sounds good.
Another thing to visit, if you're here, is the Welland Canal. It's actually the fifth generation of the Welland Canal, the current one, and it raises boats that 100 meters between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie through a series of 7 locks. It handles very large lake freighters. And actually, Norwegian is now running a cruise through the Great Lakes, which goes through the Welland Canal. It would be a lovely, lovely trip and get you to see all 5 Great Lakes. At the Lake Erie end, there is Fort Erie, and there is actually a fort there that was attacked by the Americans, and a battle that occurred out there. I think it's called the Battle of Chippewa. And it was one of the turning points, because after we got annoyed with the Americans attacking the British Army, we marched on down to Washington and burned down the White House in retaliation. So,
oh dear.
Yeah, well, but there's lovely history in terms of the United Empire Loyalists, and there's lots of old graveyards and great places to look at the history, and it's well represented here. Winery tours are a terrific thing to do. If you are staying overnight here, you can book a winery tour that will take you around to 5 or 6 different wineries, and you don't have to drive. You can imbibe, and you can certainly buy all the wine you can carry.
Yeah, that sounds good. So would you say, so if I started off in Toronto and then incorporated some of these places on a drive, because we would probably drive, so if you're driving down, you could incorporate these places and then kind of end in Niagara Falls, or you could kind of do that Toronto, Niagara Falls, and then wind your way back up to Toronto, going via a lot of these places.
You could go both ways. If I was to lay out an itinerary, what I would probably do is start in Toronto in the morning in the car. I would stop in a little town called Grimsby, which is just around the corner of the lake from Toronto, headed to Niagara Falls. And there is a street that has what we call the Painted Ladies. And these are beautiful old turn-of-the-century houses that are painted in the most psychedelic of colors. And it's just a lovely place to stop and have a bite to eat and have a coffee and take a look at these painted ladies in the town of Grimsby.
Oh, sounds good.
You can continue on down the highway, and you'll get off and go to the Welland Canal viewing platform and museum. It's located at Lock 3, and the museum gives you the history of how they actually built the canal and opened it up, because the canal goes back to the early 1800s and is an amazing engineering feat. And you can actually watch the freighters move up and down through the lock. They go pretty much consistently from March right through until November. They close the canal for the winter because obviously it'll freeze up and the ships can't get through.
Yeah.
And it would cause a problem if you had a ship frozen in the middle of a lock. So then I would continue on to Niagara Falls and maybe spend a day or two in Niagara Falls looking around. And as a side trip, go over to Niagara on the Lake. Niagara on the Lake is about a half a day. And if you include some wineries in that trip, it's probably a full day. You could also visit Fort George when you're in Niagara on the lake. So if I was going to do it, as I said, I would drive through, spend the day leisurely getting to Niagara Falls, spend a day in Niagara Falls, go over and spend a day in Niagara on the lake and wine country, back to Niagara Falls, maybe do a couple more events, and then go back to Toronto, maybe stopping in Vineland where I live and going to a few wineries there on the way home.
This all sounds great.
But that would be a perfect 3 or 4 day side trip from Toronto.
Well, that sounds perfect. That sounds excellent. I'm definitely going to be adding that to my itinerary next year, I can tell you, John.
If you're only in Toronto for a week or 5 days, you can definitely do Niagara Falls in a day, but you'll be a little bit pushed. You can take advantage of the sort of inexpensive one-day $60 pass to get into 3 or 4 of the best attractions.
I mean, it's great to know that you can do that. If you're just spending a couple of days in Toronto before you're heading off somewhere else, that you can actually include Niagara Falls, because I know it's such a bucket list destination for so many people around the world.
Oh, it is. And there's so many hotels. And of course, for honeymooners, there's several hotels that kind of have heart-shaped bathtubs and mirrored walls and that kind of thing, if that floats your boat for the honeymoon.
Yeah.
There's wonderful restaurants in Niagara Falls. One of the best is actually a chain restaurant. It's in the Embassy Suites Hotel, and it's called the Keg Restaurant. And it literally looks right out over Niagara Falls. So if you can call ahead and reserve a window seat, you'll have the most amazing view while you eat your dinner. And it's a steakhouse, so.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. That sounds great. Well, I'm going to wrap up, John, but I'm going to ask the question that I ask at the end of all my podcasts, whether it's a Global Travel Planner podcast or the UK Travel Planner podcast. I always end with the same question, which is, what would be your number one tip for somebody planning a trip to Niagara for the first time?
Don't go on a weekend in the summer.
Perfect.
Unless you like crowds.
Yeah, unless you're really busy. Well, thank you so much, John, for coming on to the podcast. It's been fantastic talking to you and finding out all about Niagara, whether it's the first time somebody's visiting or, like me, a long time in between visits. It's so good to kind of refresh my knowledge of the area and find out so much about the part of the world that you live in.
Well, you'd love Niagara Falls, but you'd love Toronto as well. It's Toronto's changed. It's very cosmopolitan. It's got amazing food. It's so multicultural. I can't think of another city in the world like it, to be honest.
Well, you'll have to come on another podcast and talk about Toronto, John.
Sure. Well, and I'm looking forward to seeing you, hopefully next year.
Yeah, hopefully. We're busy putting our plans together for next year. So, it would be fantastic to get back to Toronto and meet up with you as well.
Well, there's a TBEX in Quebec, so you can always just add one on, head over to Toronto and Niagara.
Yeah, I did see that. We'll have to see what transpires next year when it comes to visiting places and what we're doing. So, yeah, it'll be exciting. It'll be good to meet up with you. But thanks so much for coming on to the podcast. I know it's your first podcast that you've done before, I think, is it?
Actually, it's the first one I've been interviewed on. So, yes, I'm usually on the other end listening.
Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks again for having me. And if you do get a chance, go over and take a look at bucketlistthings.com and see what I'm doing.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Global Travel Planning Podcast. For more details and links to everything we discussed today, check out the show notes at globaltravelplanning.com. Remember, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on your favourite podcast app, because your feedback helps us reach more travel enthusiasts just like you. Anyway, that leaves me to say, as always, happy global travel planning.